Is there time for questions? I don't know who's in charge. But yeah, let's just do it until they stop us.
I'm given the first 5 minutes, so sorry if I'm asking something you already explained, but out of the plethora of psychedelic substances, I was wondering why you chose LSD and psilocybin. You're mentioning the 5-HT affinity.
Yep.
And maybe I was wondering if you include maybe the mescaline, DMT.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is why LSD and why psilocybin? Why did we look at those? Well, psilocybin we looked at, honestly, I think our greater interest at the time, at least at the time, was probably on with LSD. But LSD is a provocative, 3 letters, and it would be, I think it would have been harder to have got permission really to have done that research. Now I think we can say in hindsight that it's right that we got to do that research and that it was certainly worth it and that we've learned a lot from it. Psilocybin now I actually think arguably has the greater therapeutic promise. The majority of the therapeutic work with psychedelics, at least the modern therapeutic work, was done in the 50s and 60s with LSD, so there wasn't so much with psilocybin. Now that's changing slightly. There are more studies looking at psilocybin and its therapeutic potential. That's not something I cited, but it's worth knowing that people in the US, in Switzerland, are looking at psilocybin and other psychedelics in things like end-of-life anxiety, the fear of death, in end-stage cancer and such like, to provide really, I think, that bigger picture, that perhaps the kind of modeling of what it is to die and to lose that sense of self that we hold so dear, And the other thing to say is we'll look at those as well. So we're going to look at dimethyltryptamine next. Ayahuasca is fascinating. There are researchers in Brazil and Barcelona looking at ayahuasca. Mescaline's interesting as well. It's rich pickings, I often say. There's so much to do. So, thanks. I saw you first, so let's do that. Yeah, at the back top right, my right, top left. I think that's a golden question, really. Is how much of it's the chemical effect? Could you give these compounds without the psychological support? Is there something intrinsically healing, if you want, about the experience? And then how much of it's contingent on the framework, the change in perspective? What's the mapping there? In terms of the mapping, I think it's one around change, so some kind of sort of, in a way, dramatic change in perspective and perspective really. But what's the nature of that change? Well, it seems to be one in the direction of greater flexibility of thought. Typically, patients report feeling sort of more headspace after the experience. They don't report and they don't show sort of manic-like behaviors and sort of drive and I must get on kind of things, or a kind of worrying sort of wellness. They're more likely to report a kind of calm afterwards. And so I think one way to think of it is a kind of normalization of in depression at least, of a system that's become entrenched and sort of limited in its dynamics. And what we introduce with the psychedelic is a kind of freeing of the dynamics, greater fluidity. What might that map onto psychologically? Well, I think it is a more fluid, flexible state. Is that intrinsically healing? I wouldn't want to rule it out, actually. But I don't think it's necessarily healing, in that things could go wrong. And that's one of the reasons why we have the therapeutic support there. So you do induce a state of plasticity, a state of flexibility, and you try in a sort of supportive kind of holding way, not in a sort of harsh directive way, to sort of facilitate a positive direction with that state of heightened plasticity. So it's like anything, it's like the relationship between the mind and the brain. They're different on the level of our descriptions of them, but of course they're flip sides of the same coin, and the relationship is, at least on some level, one-to-one. You know, the mind is of the brain.
I was just curious, very quickly, when you read the quote at the end, there are a lot of these kind of tropes that you hear a lot. You know, so maternal figures, talks of love, talks of
Yeah.
universality, universe. One presumes that a lot of people read that stuff all the time, and one presumes on the basis of talks about depression a lot of the time makes usual presumptions. In that case, you know, it would lead one to think that potentially it's a chemical change, because the ideas are there already. Like one shoots less she's receiving them.
Yeah, I tend to think they arise spontaneously. I think things like priming and suggestion may play a role. That's another interesting topic. I mean, it's a massive debate that we could talk about for a long time. I tend to think it's a relationship, and for fairness, I think we should probably move on. Yep.
A question as a researcher. When you do your full study, have you given thought as to how you will control the mood-altering variables in the post-treatment period? I'm concerned that some of your subjects may be Leicester City supporters, but others may be Aston Villa supporters.
Do you know, it's actually a valid point, you know, because in all seriousness, life, you know, this seems to work. We don't know how well, and it just looks promising at this stage, but it does look promising. And when people relapse, why are they relapsing? A number of different factors, but life goes on, you know, and often these individuals have tough lives, and so maybe it looks as though Aston Villa are doomed and they are going to go down, you know. I don't think that would get you, well, who knows. Depression's a complex thing, but, you know, often it's the case that these patients have horrible backgrounds, you know, you've truly suffered some very difficult things, and sometimes what they've suffered and what they've endured is actually more insidious, and it's harder to see. But I would say in every case you can kind of understand the etiology, the development of their condition and why they're unwell. At least to an extent, there's always a degree of mystery there, and you're reliant on what people will disclose to you. Should I take one more question? I'm not sure how much time we've got.
What other implications are there for this research, and how do you think we should approach this research in the future in terms of psychedelics?
Well, I'd like to see the field expand in terms of future research. I hope it's all done with the right level of safeguards in place. I think that's vital. There will be people wanting to snipe at this research because whatever they hear, they'll retain a thought in their mind, and however they attain that thought is open to question. Whether it's evidence-based, I don't know. But they'll may have an opposition where they think, well, whatever I hear from, you know, this optimistic-sounding kid, I think these are dangerous drugs, and so I think there will be people wanting to snipe, and so I think for that reason it's so important that we do the research properly and that others do as well, and that we also give a mature message about these drugs as well, and so getting those things in about that these aren't compounds, these aren't party drugs, you know, is vital. And I actually think the media are changing in terms of the way they report on these compounds, which is interesting. The Guardian recently covered one of our recent studies with LSD, and it got a huge number of hits, this particular video. And then the Daily Mail and the Sun also covered it, and they went with some sensational stories that it's hard to know whether they were even true or not, and what other compounds might be involved. I think there was one adverse event that they reported on, not in our trial, but through recreational use. And someone told me that had hardly been viewed, you know. So I think there's a change in perspective, and I think even people Increasingly, you know, we're kind of challenging the very term recreational use of psychedelics. But for those who do use psychedelics outside of the context, and of course that's the larger proportion, I slightly lost my train of thought, but no, I think they do so with greater maturity these days. I think that's the thing, and they know that they're not party drugs, and so they bear that in mind. And when they don't, and when you hear about these things going wrong, often in these tragic cases, often that hasn't been adhered to. You know, there hasn't been a sober sitter with these individuals, for example, and then things can go wrong and it can be very tragic. So, yeah. One more question, yeah? Yep, sure.
Is there any hope and
Yeah, so at the moment, psilocybin and mushrooms are Schedule 1 drugs, and that means, according to those criteria, that everyone's going, they're less interested in policy. That means that they have no recognized medicinal value, and we're requiring evidence, and others are to challenge that perspective. And also that they have a significant potential for abuse. Well, they have some potential for abuse, so does alcohol and a lot of, some other legal drugs, right? So are those criteria valid? And I think this may be, you know, in time. Again, this might be an optimistic view, but I think those criteria will have to be revised because they're not based on solid science, and especially if you look at a comparison between drugs that are legal. That's why, like, the psychoactive drugs bill was so ridiculous and why it had to be dropped in the end, because it just made no rational scientific sense. So, thank you very much.